Alright, welcome back. Incidence of attacks. In this video, we're going to discuss how elasticity determines whether the burden of paying a tax falls mainly on producers or consumers. In other words, let's just get on with it. Alright, so what is tax incidence? See, this is why I cut myself off before, because it's on the next slide. So tax incidence is a measure of who really pays a tax. So what this means is, we talked about in previous videos, the government can place a tax on the producers, which will shift the supply curve left, or it could instill a tax on buyers, which would shift the demand curve left. What we're learning now with the incidence of a tax is that it doesn't matter whether they place the tax on the buyer or the seller, that really both buyers and sellers are affected by it. And we've already seen that in the last couple of videos, how it shifts the curve left, and then it ends up where consumers pay a higher price than before and producers receive a lower price than before. So they're both affected by it. Now, what we want to determine is who's affected by it more. Is it consumers or producers that are the ones most affected by paying a particular tax? And the answer is it depends, which hopefully you're getting used to that being an answer in economics, but it depends on the elasticity. So depending on whether supply or demand is more elastic or more inelastic is going to determine whether consumers or producers are the ones who really pay the tax. So let's get right into looking at some various scenarios here. All right, so in this case, what we're doing is we have an elastic demand curve. So demand here is very elastic. It's the red curve. It's nearly horizontal. It's how flat this one is drawn. And then you have just a regular supply curve, all right? So in this case, because the demand curve is so elastic that when that tax is implemented, it's going to cause a large decrease in the quantity demanded. And so what you notice, and let's see, try to draw on here to maybe make this stand out just a little bit more. Remember that this was the original price paid. Hopefully you see me bubbling in this red here. That was the original price. Now with the size of the tax, remember the tax is going to be this vertical distance between the two supply curves. So this distance here, that's the amount of the tax. And it's going to raise the price that buyers pay to this up here. And it's labeled as P with tax. So this is essentially the price that buyers are now paying. What you notice is the price for buyers did not go up very much, and the reason is because of that very elastic demand curve, the large decrease in the quantity demanded. So consumers are paying part of the tax, but they're just paying this little thin box here that I've made in red. So the original price was over here, price without tax. Now they're paying this new price with the tax. That's the instance of the tax that has fallen on consumers. On the other hand, we notice that there is a large difference for producers, because previously they were receiving a price up here, the original equilibrium price, and now instead they are receiving this price down here, which is not labeled on here, and it should be. I'm going to change this color because yellow wasn't a good choice. But this is the price that producers are receiving. So they're receiving this price down here. They are the ones that are mostly paying this tax. You see this large rectangle incidence on producers. That's how much of the tax burden has fallen on them. So in this case, the principle here is that when the price elasticity of demand is higher than the price elasticity of supply, or said more simply, when demand is more elastic than supply, which you can see in this graph that it is, the burden of the tax is going to fall mainly on producers. Now let's consider the opposite scenario. In this case, we have a rather inelastic demand curve. It's not super inelastic, but it is more inelastic. And so what we see here is that there's going to be a larger effect that's on consumers. So again, this was our original equilibrium price, and it is labeled this time. We have price without tax, quantity without tax. Now again, this vertical distance of the supply curve shifting, that represents the quantity, or the amount of the tax, I should say. So this vertical distance is the amount of the tax. And so this gives us a new price up here. It's the price with the tax. So that's where we're operating now. So when we draw this over here, we can see that the difference here between the price with tax and the price without the tax, this vertical distance, times the quantity, that's the amount of the tax paid by consumers. So because demand is relatively inelastic, in this case, consumers are going to be the ones paying the larger share of the tax. You can see that again, producers do pay some of the tax because they are receiving a lower price than they received before. So again, I'm going to call this price of producers, and I've drawn it a little bit low, but you can see here this is the price that they are receiving. So they do lose some money. They are paying part of the tax, but again, because demand is relatively inelastic, they pay us, producers pay less of the share of the tax than consumers do. So demand inelastic, consumers pay more of the tax. And now this slide just kind of shows you all four of the possibilities. So again, we've talked about two of them already with demand. So when we have inelastic demand, consumers pay most of the tax, and again you can see that. So that's the top left, number one, inelastic demand. That orange shading, that represents the amount of the tax for consumers. The, I don't know, salmonish color, that's the price for sellers or producers, the amount of tax that they pay. And you can clearly see that in case of inelastic demand, consumers pay a much larger share of it because again, the price goes up, but their quantity demanded doesn't decrease by very much. With elastic demand, we discussed that. That's going to fall more on the producer. The other two that we didn't really discuss yet, and so you have these here for you as well, inelastic and elastic supply. So looking at number 3, when supply is elastic, consumers are going to be the ones paying most of the tax. So you can see that again with the elastic supply. We have down here our original price being right there, new price up here. This orange color doesn't really stand out enough. Maybe I should make this a little bit thicker so it does. So price originally paid by the producers there, or sorry, by the consumers there. Now the new price. So again, this orange box is bigger, showing that the consumer is the one paying most of that tax. Producers, again, they are paying some of it because their price received is lower than it was before. But ultimately, with elastic supply, consumers pay most of the tax. In elastic supply, it goes the other way, where the producer will be paying most of the tax. So again, supply is relatively inelastic. So the price received by producers is going to fall pretty significantly in this case, and the producers will be the ones that pay the majority of that tax. Hope this helps. If not, we'll go over it more in class. Definitely don't worry. This has been a LaMoney production.